The great master Atisha George Peldon Atisha, he spoke of 3 levels of spiritual endeavor. The first is a kind of basic self-improvement, you could say, kibochung in Tibetan. And the second, a kind of quest for higher transcendence. And he mentions that a problem with both of these is that one easily falls into an escapist syndrome. One easily starts using one's spiritual practice or spiritual path, if you will, spiritual activities, as a way of avoiding worldly problems and the bigger situation of the world. And Nagarjuna, the great 2nd century master, in his Madhyamaka Karika Shastra, terms this kind of a development or maldevelopment, if you will, a mistaken direction in one's practice as Hinayana. In other words, one too easily becomes self-centered in one's practice. So I think in recent decades, the word Hinayana has often been wrongly used to speak about particular countries of Buddhism, whereas in the Nagarjuna sense and in the Atisha sense, it's really referring to a kind of an escapism in spiritual practice. And Nagarjuna mentions 2 kinds of these, the Shravaka and the Pratyeka. Shravaka, meaning someone who just listens and listens and listens to sermons and teachings and receives initiations and transmissions and so forth, but really just gets stuck at that doesn't really carry over to the bigger universal situation. And the Pratyeka, Rangsangye in Tibetan, meaning the one who gets into intensive solitary practice, intensive solitary meditation. But that solitary meditation very easily becomes a kind of an isolationism, and again, an abnegation of one's greater responsibility toward the world. So all of the Lam Rim are sort of stages in practice, stages in training. Literature of Tibet dedicates a chapter to trying to transcend or taking care to avoid this pitfall of spiritual escapism. I think I was once at a Buddhist conference in Australia, and one of the monks said, well, when we talk about ethics and the higher trainings in ethics and meditation and wisdom, very often we see the escapist side being that people take a greater interest in other people's ethics than they do in their own. When they meditate, they sit on their meditation cushion very intensely, and when they get up from their meditation cushion and walk around, they're very arrogant and proud of their meditation practice and very condescending towards others who don't meditate as much as them. And in terms of wisdom, they read lots of books and quote lots of great passages, but don't seem to actually catch the real inner meaning of any of them. So spiritual escapism is really talking about that kind of a thing, where one listens to a lot of Dharma, like the Shravaka tradition, the Shravaka model. Shravaka literally means listeners. Or one does a lot of intense sitting, but with no real social integration. Great efforts are made in the Lamrim and Lojong literatures of Tibet, of all schools of Tibetan Buddhism, I should add. Great effort is made to assist in training, assist the practitioner to avoid these two pitfalls. And the main method of doing so is to contemplate the universal situation. In other words, all beings are related to oneself. One has brothers and sisters, mother and father, perhaps even children. And those beings are all connected to other beings, and those beings to other beings ad infinitum. Or as Nagarjuna puts it in one of his passages, all beings mothers in one's previous life. So in terms of using spirituality to avoid one's universal responsibility, the main key becomes cultivating awareness of one's own interdependence with all other beings. And the seventh Dalai Lama expresses that in many of his Lojong poems. All beings one's mother in a previous life. How ignoble it would be for oneself to ignore them. Nagarjuna, in his exchanging self-awareness for awareness of others, and his Ratnavali, everything we have comes from others. Everything in our life comes from, we learn our language from others, passed down through others. We get clothing from others. We get our education from others. Our very life comes from others. We borrow the drop of ovum and the drop of sperm from others to have this life. And all things are infinitely interconnected, so the drop of sperm and ovum just doesn't stop with one's mom and dad, but of course all of their mums and dads back through millenniums and through the connection that all those beings had with other beings. That, as Nagarjuna puts it in the Suraleka, his good-hearted letter to a king, that if we were to look at any aspect of our life, we'll see an infinite amount of interconnection with other living beings. That's kind of paraphrasing what he says, but anyway, comes down to that. Everything, just one aspect of our life becomes as large as a great mountain of interconnectivity. So the best way to avoid escapism in one's spiritual practice is to always cultivate awareness of one's interconnectivity with others and one's debt to others. I sometimes point out that a key feature of the Buddhist attitude towards others in terms of, say, practice of love or compassion, I think some spiritual traditions, compassion is like we who are blessed sharing our blessings with lower beings, giving to the poor, helping the sick, and so on and so forth. We're healthy, we help the sick. We're in the advantageous position. We've got a little extra, we give to some beggars. We're in the advantageous position, they're in a disadvantaged position. And I very much appreciate this idea mentioned by Nagarjuna, of course coming from the Buddha, but stressed by Nagarjuna, and then further carried to a whole new level of poetry and eloquence by the great Sangha, are all beings my mother in a previous life. And in this way, thinking of beings like that is more like a child looking up to the mother with deepest respect, rather than me the healthy helping the sick, me the wealthy helping the poor, and so on. It's looking up to the sick, looking up to the poor, rather than looking down at them. And I think this is a key point in the Buddhist practice, and it's a key point in how one avoids the escapist syndrome of either just listening, and thinking oneself really the cat's whiskers because of the number of teachings or lineages one has heard or lineages one has received, or intense solitary practice where one just becomes self-complacent with solitary practice. In Buddhist Abhidharma, they talk about 3 realms of devas, 3 realms of gods, all of which are limited, all of which come to an end, all of which end in death and then falling down to the lower realms and starting again. And one of those is a kind of a very strong meditation where you can have samadhi held for hours and days and weeks on end, with no real spiritual transformation. It's just kind of a mental power, like a weightlifter able to hold 500 pounds for 30 seconds or something like that. And 30 seconds, it's a long time with 500 pounds, and being able to hold your mind on one object for a month without moving or whatnot is impressive in some ways. But it's said in Buddhist Abhidharma that if one does so without achieving both the experience of the infinity of one's soul on the one hand, and the direct appreciation of one's interconnectedness with all other living beings on the other hand, if one does that, then it's really just a pause in one's spiritual quest, and it's a kind of an escapist pause. When Gompopa came to Milarepa, he said to Milarepa, I can hold my meditation for a week without moving, and I'd like to train under you. And Milarepa said, well, holding your mind in one place in meditation for a week without moving is nice, but it's not enlightenment. The implication is a kind of spiritual escapism. And the other is this idea in Buddhism of emptiness, meditation on emptiness that we hear in many Buddhist traditions, or selflessness or non-self and so on. If one's samadhi one's meditation gets locked there and stuck at that level, but one fails to bring it back from emptiness to the infinity of the interconnectedness of oneself with all other living beings, then it's said it just brings rebirth in the arupa loka, the realm of formlessness. And again, one just gets stuck there for a few, breaths of Brahma, few, millenniums or something. And one can look at these as metaphors for the kind of escapist syndromes that are being discussed, that essentially just escaping in a kind of formal structure of spiritual practice, or escaping into a kind of a formlessness of being without really touching to the essence of one's interconnectedness with all beings. That itself becomes a problem that renders one's practice non-practice, or renders one's practice ineffective.
한가하니 흐른 산등 흩들어오던 수밀지지 하르기듯 하우슬러 잡질라서니 무릉 골리고스 멜리리 팅큰 텔리리 팅큰 바이님이 기띠기친 유르도 줄지테 히띠리 테리 힝우금 보르도 한가에다 노타게민